Good morning. I thought we might want to do a sound check just to make sure everybody can hear me okay. If you can hear me okay, could you type something in the chat window? Well, if you can't hear me okay, chat, type something in the chat window. Okay? Excellent. Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm honored to be a part of this and to follow up on Deanna's earlier presentation, earlier webinar back in December. And I'm very excited to talk to you about this exciting pedagogy called team-based learning. I also wanted to shout out to Ulysses for all of his help, as well as Lucas in trying to get this set up. And of course, I want to thank all of you for coming as well. I really salute the fact that you're so interested in teaching, that you're going to take time out of your busy day to spend time with me. I would also really encourage you to type any questions, or if you have anything that you really would like to say. I'm not concerned about interrupting the flow here, so please do feel free to chime in with a question when you can, and I'll try to keep the flow going here. My name is Mark Serva. Good morning for those of you in the United States, North America, South America. For those colleagues of ours in Europe and in Asia, good afternoon and good evening. I really do appreciate you coming here. I am an associate professor of MIS at the University of Delaware in the United States, and I'm also the secretary for the PAN-PBL Association, and I'm the former director for the Institute for Transforming Undergraduate Education here at the University of Delaware, which has done a lot of work in the area of problem-based learning. I also do consulting work in the area of problem-based learning, and I visited many continents in that capacity, and I've really enjoyed working with faculty, so I welcome this opportunity to spend some time with you this morning. So why team-based learning? It's something that is, I think, a lot of misconceptions. I think if I had to change one thing about team-based learning, I think I'd probably change the name. Many people say, well, I use Teams, so I must be doing team-based learning. There is actually a specific pedagogy called team-based learning, and we're going to talk a little bit about its background in a few minutes. But team-based learning is a well thought out pedagogy. It has a lot of really interesting strengths, and I think one of the things we should talk about is that Deanna Dolman's webinar back in December, she did an excellent job, and one of the things that she talked about is that PBL, for example, its ability, its strength is highly contingent on its context. It's dependent on whether or not certain pieces fall into place. And I think that's one of the reasons why understanding a different pedagogy can be so powerful, because it gives you a different tool. It gives you options that you can actually use in different situations. It gives you an alternative. Instead of falling back on lecture, it gives you some ideas in terms of something you could do in a different context. It allows you, for example, to change things up in your class so that you can try something different. I find students often respond to something that is new and untried in a class, and so it has those capabilities as well. I feel also that the TBL offsets some of the weaknesses in PBL. I've used PBL a lot over the years, and some of the things I find, for example, is that with PBL it can be a challenge to find the right problem. Especially to satisfy if I have specific learning objectives that I need to fulfill. So I find that the TBL is a little more efficient in that regard. Time, PBL can take more time to accomplish learning objectives, and TBL can be a little more directed and a little more time efficient, I think, in terms of still accomplishing and still nurturing student learning. Still allowing you to avoid the lecture and the stand and deliver approach. It still allows you to engage students, but it gives you a wonderful opportunity to actually use your teams and grow teams in different ways. The other thing I should mention is that TBL has a capacity or a framework that allows you to structure your class. And one of the things about PBL is that it doesn't really inform, so to speak, how to actually structure a course over a semester. Here in the United States, for example, our semesters are around 13 to 15 weeks. TBL, which we're going to talk about, makes recommendations for how to structure over the course of a semester. And then I find that what I do is I will slot PBL problems at strategic locations within the framework that TBL offers. So again, has a lot of capacity to address, I think, some of the PBL's weaknesses. And I think by combining the two and thinking of the two together synergistically, I think it becomes the two become greater than actually their individual components. Again, I welcome everybody. I wanted to give this a little bit of an overview so you kind of knew what we were going to be doing today. I encourage questions over the course of the talk, the presentation. There will actually be opportunities for you to chime in where I'm going to ask you some specific questions, which is consistent with team-based learning. I'd ask that you do so in the chat window. I will do the best I can to monitor the questions as they come in and take the questions as they come in. Because I think anything that I'm missing, I would encourage you to ask questions to clarify. So let's get into the presentation a little bit. Again, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'll look forward to hearing your questions, and hopefully you'll find this a good experience. So what is team-based learning? Well, it was created by a gentleman named Larry Michelson at the University of Oklahoma. Larry is still very active in the team-based learning community. The group is called the TBL Collaborative. They have regular annual meetings. It's a wonderful group of people. They're very engaged. They're very helpful to people who are interested in TBL. I think their next meeting is in Florida, coming up in Orlando. So if you're interested, look at the TBL Collaborative. It is a website that you can look at. Larry was trying to find a way to engage students in larger classes. And so he worked through this pedagogy and came up with this approach. And it's been developed and nurtured over the time. It's been modified slightly. There are a number of really, really good books out there on the topic. So if you are interested, I would encourage you to take a look at many of the books written by Michelson, Jim Sibley, Bill Roberson, D. Fink. So there's a number of really good books out there on the topic that you can explore after we're done today. The four essential principles of team-based learning is that, first of all, we want to form groups well. I never let students choose their own teams, and the reason is, of course, is that they do a terrible job of choosing their own teams. They want to be on teams with friends, and it makes it go easier on themselves. They tend to choose their more homogeneous teams than I would like. I want a variety of skill sets. I tend to rely on randomization or a process that encourage randomization. I want more heterogeneous teams in my classes. So students must also be held accountable for their individual and their group work. So there are certain processes that we're going to talk about, more specifically the RAP process, the Readiness Assurance process. We're going to talk about to encourage students to come to class prepared. What a concept, right? Believe it or not, at the University of Delaware, and I know this is going to be shocking, we actually do get students in class who don't come to class prepared. I might actually assign them Chapter 4. And believe it or not, there are some students who don't come to class and have read Chapter 4. And I'm sure that's different in your institution. So what we're going to talk about is ways to actually encourage those students to come to class prepared, but also, if they don't, to try to get them up the learning curve hurdle so that we can actually still engage them and use them in some way to actually get them a part of some kind of an exercise so that they're not just sitting back and looking and completely unable to participate, but instead be able to actually participate and still be engaged. So that's a really nice feature of team-based learning. So the group assignments must promote both learning and team development. We want to actually use the team as a learning mechanism, which is great. And in my discipline, which is MIS, we're basically like kind of like computer science and business. We do things with project management, things like that. It is an inherently team-based discipline, so this is a logical fit for me. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the concept of feedback. You're going to find that with team-based learning that there's a nice mechanism here, and that is that the in-class exercises tend to be very hands-on and application-oriented, while the out-of-work material tends to be more knowing and uh, foundational concepts. Very similar to the concept, of course, of flipping the class. I'm sure all of you have heard of that. So, it's a nice mechanism. If you are looking to move toward a inverted or flipped model, team-based learning has mechanisms to help you do that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the planning phase here. And the reason is that, as I mentioned earlier, team-based learning has a mechanism to help you structure a course over the course of a semester. They use the concept of modules, and typically a module for a 13 to 15 week semester in the United States would be probably around maybe 4 to 6 modules or so. You're going to break the class into digestible chunks. Okay, so each semester or each module may be 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 weeks. We want to identify, we want to be more backward driven in terms of our design. So identifying both the learning as well as the knowing objectives within a module. The idea of a module makes it much easier to think about what is it I want to accomplish in this particular module of the class. So it's a little bit easier to think about than over the course of an entire semester. Now, this is an important concept. You might say, well, what is a module then? A module is basically that the amount of material you could expect students to read or do at the start of a module. So for the United States, we might do, for example, 2 or maybe 3 chapters, because within team-based learning, all of the readings and all of the preparation are due at the very start of the module. So you don't want to say 6 chapters, it's just too much material. And what the research indicates is that if you give them 6 chapters, they'll spend the same amount of time as they do on 2 chapters. In other words, students kind of earmark 2 hours, for example, for preparation. If you give them 6 chapters, they'll still spend about 2 hours preparing. If you give them 2 chapters, they'll spend the 2 hours. That's what the research tends to indicate. So what team-based learning says is that instead of assigning a chapter a week, you assign all the material at the very start of the module and have that due. Those are the foundational knowing objectives, and that is what we want students to understand coming into the module. The minute they walk into the module, those readings are due. No lecture, no questions. They walk in, start of the module, we do a rap quiz. And that's how one of the reasons students tend to come to class prepared. Class time, as I mentioned, is focused on feedback, and you can, of course, conclude a module with a summative assessment. I tend to do every other module or so with the summative assessments, but certainly doing a homework assignment, project, PBL problem as a concluding element certainly works as well. This is kind of a graphical representation of how TBL works over the course of a semester. Now, as I mentioned on the slide, the modules do tend to go, we tend to have maybe more like 4 to 6 modules for space concerns. I think you get the idea. But you'll notice here in Module 1, the readings are due immediately as soon as students walk in, and then we give them a quiz. The quiz, and we'll talk about in detail, there is a very interesting mechanism for the RAP quiz. It's not just your standard quiz. There's more than that, and you'll see that in a minute. Then we do what are called application exercises. Application exercises are kind of the TBL version of a PBL problem. They can be very inquiry-based, and we'll talk about, and you'll actually experience an application exercise in a few minutes. But they do tend to be more about, like I said, more of like a PBL problem, but not exactly. You'll see how they work in just a minute. And then at the conclusion of that module, you might do a summative assessment, a homework assignment, or a project. Once the module is completed in 2 or 3 weeks or so, you move on to the next module. Again, the same rhythm. It's one of the things I like about TBL is there is this kind of rhythm to a class. The students know what's due, when it's due, because everything is kind of paced the same way over the course of the semester. At the same time, you still can change it up by doing a PBL problem or a project or whatever, either as a summative or, of course, a formative assessment. So I hope that helps. Let's move on. Now let's talk a little bit about the RAP. The RAP is a really interesting process, and I'll tell you what, students don't, of course, like quizzes, believe it or not. Um, I'm sure that doesn't shock you, but I think what I found over the years in doing this is that students have a certain begrudging respect for this process, because they do see that by going through this RAP process, it enables me to ask more of them. It also enables me to allow more time in class to do hands-on work as opposed to me lecturing. And the other nice thing about TBL is that it does, I want to say, put lecture more in a context, and you'll see that here in just a second. It enables my lectures to be more effective, and you'll see why. So over the course of a RAP, now this is one day, so this lays out the RAP process for one day. The RAP, and I see on the screen here, this may be a little bit difficult to read, so I do apologize for that. I hope it's not too bad. The readings are due at the start of class, typically 2 to 3 chapters, maybe an hour and a half or so of video, or the equivalent, something along that line. The IRAP, I stands for individual. The IRAP is basically 10 questions on the reading. It's individual accountability. It's checking whether or not students individually have come to class prepared. And there's nothing earth-shattering about this. It's pretty much a standard quiz. And again, we'll do this in just a second, and you'll see this process. The questions on the RAP quiz, you should do a mixture of foundational, even maybe definitional questions, but those should be more in the minority. I think in general, you want to try to create really challenging multiple choice questions, staying away from none of the above, all of the above, giving students the expectation that they're going to have to make difficult decisions. I try to phrase the questions on the line of what is the best answer, or which one doesn't belong in this list, or something, giving the students a chance to exercise maybe different types of skills during the quiz. But for the most part, this is a quiz. Now we move on to the TRAP, and the TRAP is the team part. So I collect all of the individual questions, all the individual quizzes. And then what you do is you return and give them back the exact same quiz, and now they take it as a team. The advantage of this is that there's a lot of very interesting dynamics going on here. First of all, students have answered, and they know what their answers are on the individual part. Now they go to the team. In their team, they have to reach a consensus. They have to discuss. They have to debate. They have to argue. But they also have to listen to the other perspective. If they got it wrong on the individual part, they want to get it right on the team part. And so they have to be open to the other perspectives. They have to listen. They have to actually hear what the other person is saying, weigh whether or not they think that other answer is more correct than their answer. And so it becomes a very interesting dynamic. This is the way that team-based learning brings up the students who are not prepared and brings them up to the level where they can be productive for an exercise during class. They have to listen, and if they didn't come to class prepared, they probably didn't do well on the individual part, so they really now want to do well on the team part. So that's one of the very interesting mechanisms. While the TRAP is going on and students are discussing, debating, arguing, and trying to come up with a consensus, I'm going through the individual quizzes to see how they did on the individual part. I don't grade them, but I do is I look to see patterns. Everybody got question 1 right. Few people missed number 2. 3 was a real problem. A lot of misconceptions on number 3. And then I go through and I look and I make notes as they're going through the TRAP or the IRAP. So the IRAP helps me understand how they did as a class, the misconceptions, the gaps in knowledge. So I make a note of that as they're taking the TRAP quiz. Once the TRAP is finished, then I go on to what's called the appeal. The appeal is a very interesting mechanism because what we want to do as students, we want to encourage students to question, to actually challenge us in terms of our teaching. That's one of the things that I really like about teaching, is that when we get students who say, I think you're wrong, and here's why, and we don't get enough of that. The appeal is an opportunity for students to question that. This you have to use a little bit of discretion with this, but what I encourage students to do is, if you think you have an answer that is as good or could be interpreted as a correct answer, write the appeal. And the appeal is typically 1 or 2 paragraphs. It's done with the group. They do it for 5 to 10 minutes after the TRAP. I give them an opportunity to put together an email and make the case as to why a particular question they should get credit for it. If they do a good job with that, I give them the point. In the grand scheme of the semester, the point largely is not going to matter. But what we're doing is we're encouraging them to debate and argue and question and bring in some of those higher order skills by making the case that this should be the correct answer. So that's the appeal. And then lastly, the mini lecture. Now you'll notice what happens. Instead of the lecture being paramount here, the lecture is secondary. The lecture is used to clarify. And by using the IRAP results and the patterns that I've seen, I can now actually customize just in time my lecture. But also notice that instead of lecturing and then doing an exercise with the time that remains, the whole process, whatever it takes, that's how I tailor my lecture. If I have 10 minutes left, that's the lecture. If I have 15 minutes left, that's the lecture. So for the most part, at most, I'm doing 20 minutes. But as long as I'm clarifying, the lecture is structured around the quiz itself, all right, the quiz itself. And that way, I actually add structure to the lecture, because instead of introducing Chapter 4, I'm going back to something they've already seen, and I'm clarifying Chapter 4, the concepts that they've already missed. They've been in the context of the question, so hopefully this is going to make more sense to them, and that the lecture now becomes more effective because I'm clarifying concepts that they've already seen. I see Pedro, and by the way, Pedro did a great job with our PAN-PBL conference here back in February, and I see Pedro has actually made a note about the appeal. So thank you for that comment, Pedro. If anybody else has any other comments, please feel free to post them, and I'll try to make a note of those as well. So let's move on. Now, when you walk in, now you did not actually have readings due today, but it's interesting when I do consulting work, because I do give the participants a reading to do before the workshop. And you may also be startled to learn that some of the teachers actually don't do the readings. So this becomes a nice mechanism to reinforce the idea that we do need to have some level of accountability, because even we sometimes aren't prepared for what we should be ready for. So the idea of this is to give you a chance to think about how this RAP process works. You did not have readings due. I know you may not know everything about the team-based learning, and you may not even have a basis to answer these questions, but that's okay. That's all right. We're gonna actually run with it and just do the best you can. For the purposes of the IRAP, because it would kind of ruin the process if you typed in the answer in the quiz window, in the chat window rather. So what I'd like you to do is just think about what you think is the correct answer. You might even write it down on a sheet of paper. I think that's actually a good exercise, because you're committing yourself to a particular answer. You can't say later on, well, that's what I would have chosen. Write down the answer here. It's going to be A, B, C, or D. Okay? No collaboration. Please don't type in the chat window. We'll have an opportunity to do that in a minute. Here's the question. All right. So what is the purpose? What's the main objective of the readiness assurance process? And you've got 4 choices here. So go ahead and choose which one you think is the correct answer. I'll just give you a few seconds here. Dead air in a webinar, I guess, is not probably a good thing, so I don't want to wait too long. But all right, so I'm going to assume you've had a chance to read that. All right, that's good. And next, we're going to go on. We actually have another question too. So again, now we have not actually talked about application exercises, but I'm going to see how you do on this. Again, give yourself a chance. The main objective of an application exercise is it problem-solving, discussion, understanding the readings, or applying the readings to a real context. Commit yourself to a particular answer, maybe even write it, like I said, write it down on a sheet of paper so you can't change your mind later. Now, that's the IRAP. That was the IRAP. We're going to move on now to a quasi-TRAP to make sure you understand This would not be done the way we're doing it now if you were really doing it with team-based learning. But the mechanism that we're using here, of course, the webinar, doesn't lend itself well to breaking you up into teams. So what I'm going to ask you to do is use the chat window. I'm going to put the questions up that you just saw, and I'd like you to use the chat window. And I'd like you to see and type in your, and of course you're going to have to do this really quickly, and but make your case. Why do you think the answer is A, B, C, or D for the particular question? Type as much as you want, and then we're going to try to reach a consensus. And I'll look and see what the results were in the chat window, and I'll report back and say, what did you answer as a, quote, team? All right, are we ready? Here we go. Here's the question. Same question that I just gave you. This is the TRAP process. So let me start seeing some typing here. Type in what you think is the correct answer. Let's see here. Nothing yet. We get a couple of responses, a couple of things. We got 20 people here, so come on, let's see a couple of questions here. All right, there's one person. So when somebody says they think the answer is C. Anybody else? All right, well, we're going to move on here, but I think the goal here is to try, of course, to get students to debate. And I understand with the chat window, it's more of a challenge. Pedro said the answer he thinks is D. Somebody else said B. That's good. We're getting some responses here. Leandro says B. That's good. All right, we're starting to get some answers. So we're all over the place on this question, but that's really good. I think one of the things about team-based learning that is really exciting is that it's very formative. So if you make mistakes, it's okay. Now the question here, we're getting, I think the consensus tends to be, and I'm seeing the answers posted here, the answer tends to be B. And this is really great because now this is feedback for me as the instructor. I think, in general, I've looked at your quizzes, and I think now, in general, people tend to think that the answer is B. So that gives me feedback, and it gives me an anchor point. We're going to move on now to the next question, and we'll go through the correct answers. The next question here. And by the way, there is quite a delay in this broadcast. It's about 5 to 10 seconds, so I have to give you a little bit more time here, I think, to get an opportunity to answer. So now what's the main objective of application exercises? Application exercises, the purpose of the application exercise is, like I said, it's kind of like a PBL problem. It's not quite, but so what is the purpose of the application exercise? Let's see if we can get some answers posted here. And I will give you the answer to the question in just a minute. Anybody have a suggestion? What is the purpose of an application exercise? Let's see here. Is it problem solving? Is it to encourage discussion? This is probably a tougher question, I think. Alexander says D. Leandro says B. Good. We're getting some different answers here. That's good. Is it to understand the background readings, or is it to apply the readings to a context? Maria says D. D and B. D and B. Deanna says, Deanna, how are you? The answer is D. Good. Okay. And Pedro says D again. Recall up through Bloom's taxonomy. All right, we got a lot of good answers here. So now if you were in your team, and this where we were really doing this, you would have to reconcile those. D and B are the two that seem to be the most common here. And so now we're going to have to actually, within your team, you're going to have to reconcile D and B. Now we're not going to be able to do that in the chat window, but you get an idea. So let's move on. The correct answer to number 1 was D. The idea of the RAP process was to get students to come to class in terms of true readiness, not just a passing knowledge of the concepts, but foundational knowledge. That's the idea of the RAP process, because they've gone through the IRAP, the TRAP, as well as the appeal, and then a mini lecture. So that's a pretty rich experience for the students in terms of foundational knowledge. By the way, the goal of a RAP is not mastery, it's just foundational knowledge. So yes, and this is where I worded the question such that I think you might see how you might be able to appeal this. If you really believe that the answer was B, and I don't argue that all of these have certain aspects of correctness and could be argued, but certainly if you want to appeal this, I would entertain the appeal. If you can make a case and you can pull and use examples from the readings, from the videos, and actually make the case as to why you think B is correct, I'll give you the point, okay? Because now what you've really done is engage them in terms of their higher order learning. So let's move on to the next question. The correct answer, Pedro nailed it here. The correct answer is B. I'm sorry, B. Sorry, is D. But B also was very common, and that's also really good because, yes, it is to encourage team discussion, and it is to enrich background reading. So hopefully you can see how this question, even though I do have an answer, and I do believe, by the way, the D and D are the best correct answers, if you want to think about it that way. It does give students an opportunity to engage by appealing and making their case for how they think the question is correct. Their answers are correct. All right, now let's move on to the next part. So that's the preparation phase. That is that the students are going to come to class, they're going to be prepared, they're going to be ready to go now, and now you've got them actually into the material. Cognitively, we've gotten through that first phase of foundational knowledge, and now what we want to do is move on to what I call the doing objectives. The RAP process deals with knowing. What is it we want students to know? But the application exercise deals with doing. What is it we want students to be able to do with that foundational knowledge? What kind of problems do we want them to solve? What kind of decision making do we want them to do? What kind of higher order thinking and analytical reasoning do we want them to be able to do? So these are the foundational concepts of application exercises. And we're going to focus on feedback. These exercises are usually not done for a grade. They're done solely for feedback and for you to give an opportunity of what is better than this answer. What kind of things are you looking for on the test or the final assessment, that type of thing. And they tend to build over the course of a module. They get more and more challenging. By the way, you don't have to only do application exercises in team-based learning. You can, of course, mix in a case study or a PBL problem. It's very flexible in that way. So we're going to do an application exercise. You may see and you may think that this application exercise is very similar to a RAP question. There's more going on here than you think there is, okay? And so I'm going to give you an opportunity. I want you individually, now it says the video here says team. We don't actually, of course, have teams, but this is the way you would present it if you were doing it in class. I will present your team with 4 choices in the form of a multiple choice question. What I want you to do individually is I want you to give yourself just a couple of seconds to look at the question and think about, this is going to be applying the foundational concepts of TBL to solve a problem, okay? And again, I would like you to use the window. I'm going to talk a little, the chat window. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it differs from a RAP question. Because remember, this is being done during class. Do not type in, though, until I tell you to do so, okay? So please, do not type in the window until I tell you to do so. Now, the challenge is we have a little delay and there's some latency, so just bear with me. We'll do the best we can. Here is the question. You're designing a driver's education course. From the following activities, these are the activities that you could do in class. You could do a driving simulator, a RAP quiz, a rules of the road test, or practice by driving on a busy highway. Which of these, so that they're consistent with TBL, how would you design the class? Use the numbers, put them in the order, and just give yourself maybe just a couple of seconds to think about which one you think is the correct answer. The numbers, of course, are all in different orders. The first one, of course, is actually putting them out on the highway to start, and it ends with the driving simulation. A, B, C, or D. Okay? So when you come to your answer, when you think what it is, I'm going to say go. All right? And when I say go, don't look at the chat window, just type in your answer. Okay? Ready? Go. Type in your answer, which one you think is the correct answer. Now, of course, with the latency, we have a little bit of delay here. Leandro comes in with C. Paulo says C. Alexander says C. We got a lot of C. C. All right, a lot of C's. Okay. All right. Now, this is a really interesting situation. Everybody is saying C. Okay, so I'm going to be honest with you. There is not a correct answer here. There is not a correct answer here. But now everybody converged on C. But notice here, C starts with a rap quiz. I have a lot of things I can do here. If this were actually happening in class, the way I would do it, hang on. You've probably seen these in at a wedding, okay, with your little card on it. But what I would do is I would be having these in class, and I would be at each team desk, they would have these letters. And when I would say 1, 2, 3, go, the students would take their answer and they would stick it in the card holder. All at the same time, not consecutively, sequentially, at the same time. The advantage of this is that I now have them committed to a specific answer. All of you said C. So if I were in class and everybody said C, I would say, okay, notice that you start with a rap quiz. What's the foundational knowledge that they're using to actually, what are you quizzing them on? You haven't given them any background foundational knowledge. I'm not saying C is wrong, by the way, but all of these have weaknesses. For example, I could make the case for B because 1 might be the driving simulation, which is the foundational knowledge. 2 is then the rap quiz. 3 is the rules of the road test, and 4 is the summative experience, and that is whether or not they can drive on a highway. All of these could be, for A, for example, could be that we put them out on the road to give them the real experience. Then we assess them in terms of the actual rap quiz. My point is that no matter what they answer, there is always some debate. If 2 people disagree or 2 teams disagree, that's an opportunity. So you could say to one team, why is this other team wrong? Explain to them why they're wrong. Okay? You could do a comparison. You could put them into different, kind of meta groups. These 2 teams said C. These 2 teams said B. I want you guys to do an ongoing debate now about what's the strengths and weaknesses. If everybody answers C, you could say, why didn't you answer A? So in other words, by committing them, they can't change their answer, and it gives you opportunities. So this is the idea of an application exercise. It's very efficient. You can do a number of these during class in a very quick way, and it allows you to address many of the important learning issues and perhaps do it as actually a foundational experience for, let's say, a PBL problem. Okay? So some interesting ideas. When you're writing application exercises, this is called the 4S mnemonic. The idea of the 4S mnemonic is that we have a significant problem, everybody works on the same problem, they have to make a specific choice or decision, and everybody reports simultaneously. That's really important. That's actually the mechanism, the driving factor around the debate and the discussion, because by getting them to commit and actually saying at the same time, you get them to commit. They can't change their answers. They have to defend themselves in terms of a specific answer. So I see Pedro's question. The rap quiz allows the instructor to see what the learner's background knowledge, what do they think they know prior to the instruction starting. I think that's a nice way to phrase it, Pedro, actually. I think that's a really nice way to phrase it. It gives the instructor an opportunity to see what is going on in the mind of the student so that he or she could tailor lecture or exercises later to address the weak points. So thanks for that comment. So the assessment, when you're doing summative assessment, there really is no prescription within TBL as to how to do assessment. It really is more of a formative mechanism. But what I tend to do is traditional exams, projects, PBL problems as summative exercises. But it's nice because there is some level of individual accountability. If a student comes to you after an exam, let's say, and has not done well, you have a metric. You actually can look at that individual student's performance versus the team to see whether or not that student is coming to class prepared. If their individual scores tend to be seriously lower, significantly lower than the team score, it's an indication that that student is, relying on the team to get him or her prepared for class. And so that gives you something that you can work with in terms of improving that student's ability to learn. TBL does flip the class. It's a mechanism. Flipping the class has gotten a lot of buzz in the last maybe 5 years or so. It's a great idea, but beyond the mechanism of restructuring the class by putting homework outside or inside the class rather, and doing hands-on exercises inside and doing the readings outside. It doesn't really prescribe a lot in terms of how to do it. So TBL is more of fills in a lot of the gaps in terms of how you can actually do a flipped classroom. So I find it useful from that perspective. It does free up a lot of time by flipping the class. You're not doing a lecture, so you're not dedicating entire classes to a lecture. So I find that it does address the time concern in terms of the ability to fulfill learning objectives for a class. So here's some thought questions, and we can address these through the chat window. I do have some thoughts on these. I thought it might be interesting to, and I'd like you to respond to these questions, and maybe these could be a basis for our question and answer session. PBL versus TBL. I think both have their amazing strengths. I think they both have significant weaknesses. They shouldn't be used blindly. They should be used more to fit a particular situation. So I chose these 4 dimensions to discuss as maybe a mechanism for you to think about in terms of how they differ and how they could be utilized. Prompting questions. When you have questions in a PBL problem, what's the strategy in a PBL problem when you're asking students questions? At the end of a PBL problem, you have those questions right after the problem. What's the strategy there in PBL, and how does that differ from, let's say, an application exercise in terms of the questions that are asked in team-based learning? So please feel free to address any of these, because I'd love to see your comments, and I can address them as they come in, but I'd like you to actually think about this. The nature and the depth of inquiry. One of the hallmarks of PBL, of course, is that it tends to be a richer experience. You're putting students in a situation where they actually have to think like a professional, or whether it be a medical professional or an engineer. They're thinking about it from that perspective. And so the thought is that PBL is much richer and more textured, let's say, than, of course, a lecture. How does that compare with a TBL application exercise? What's the strengths and weaknesses there? So if you have any thoughts on that, please do. Pedro has said, big, ill-defined driving questions with no simple answers. Alexander says, I believe PBL uses more open questions. I think that's probably very true. TBL does tend to be much more directed and much more targeted in terms of specific learning objectives, while PBL, I think, can happen more organically, more open-ended, in a more open-ended way. The instructor role. How does the instructor's role differ in a TBL situation versus, say, a PBL situation? So if you have some thoughts, please use the chat window. I'd love to see what you have to think about that. And then lastly, student preparation. What is PBL's prescription in terms of student preparation? How do they actually frame, how does PBL frame student preparation? How do they actually get students to be prepared? And how does that differ from, say, team-based learning? What are the different mechanisms there? So if you have any thoughts on any of those, I would love to see you type in your thoughts in the chat window. Let me move on here to, I'm going to leave this up because I think we're starting to get some things up here. Let's see. Pedro says both strategies will encourage students to take greater ownership for their learning. I think that is really, that's a great point. I think there is some level of movement, certainly in PBL, from I'm going to tell you what you need to know as the instructor, and instead with PBL and TBL, you're moving that responsibility onto the student. Nasser says, good evening from Algeria. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Hope everything is going well on the African continent. Thank you for participating with us today, Nasser. Great to have your participation. Any other thoughts in terms of these dimensions, or any other questions? The last slide I will tell you is simply the standard "Are there any questions?" slide. I think I will just leave this slide up because I think it might help frame some of the questions, but certainly any questions along these dimensions or any other questions about TBL are certainly welcome. Anything else from anybody? Any other questions? Let's see here. Alexander, I believe that PBL teachers perform more like a facilitator, while TBL is more like an evaluator. I think that's a really nice observation. I agree with you. The instructor is much more of a driver of the discussion in TBL. In PBL, absolutely, much more like a facilitator. Deanna says TBL uses a structured peer feedback, which is less formalized. That's a great point. I did not really spend a lot of time on that in the talk, and Deanna makes a great point. It is definitely true that a hallmark and a center feature of TBL is student feedback and student peer evaluation, and that is a very important mechanism. Probably should be done in PBL as well, although it's much less formalized. So nice observation there. Pedro says both PBL and TBL shift the instructor. I think that's true. It gives, these two give you an option, an alternative. I find that with instructors, when I work in consulting and I work with teachers, the fallback is always to lecture. And I think that's unfortunate. I think we need to give teachers options to what can I do instead of lecture? How can I still engage the students? If a PBL problem is not appropriate at this point, how can I actually still engage them? Pedro says the instructor's role shifts from instructor, that is the giver of instructions, to the designer of learning experiences. Nice observation. I agree. It puts us in the role of, in some ways, if you think about it, the role of a professor as a lecturer is, it's important, but at the same time, the role as a designer, of you spending time designing, engaging in excellent exercises, memorable experiences for the student, is a much probably better use of our time than just simply telling students what they need to know. So nice observation, Pedro. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank all of you. We're at about a quarter of here, and I want to thank all of you for participating. I hope you found this about, Diana has another. Could you explain a little more about the differences between application exercises versus PBL problems? So let's talk a little bit maybe about the questions. That's a great question. In PBL, the goal here is to first of all, to activate prior knowledge in PBL through the definition of what do we know, and then we tend to move to learning issues, which is of course the exploration of what we don't know in the form of a question. There is no such mechanism in TBL. There is no such formal. One of the beauties of PBL is its purity in terms of the decision-making process to inform how we make decisions, not just for this problem, but for all of life's problems. That's a very high goal, and I think it's one of the biggest contributions of PBL. There is no such mechanism in TBL. The driving mechanism in TBL is forcing students to make a choice. And in some extent, it plays within that social pressure that students deal with. And getting the students to actually defend that choice is where many of the depth of discussion, and getting them to compare and contrast, and having you play devil's advocate. So I think that's one of the driving differences between a TBL application exercise and a PBL problem. PBL problems, of course, also tend to be more open-ended and tend to have multiple solutions. Application exercises, you can have multiple solutions, but those solutions are structured and actually presented as options to the students. So in that way, it's much more constrained in terms of the inquiry. Okay. So I see Ulysses typed in here. Thank you for participating. Thank you for participating. I look forward to interacting with all of you. Please feel free to send me your questions, or if you have any other items you'd like to discuss or debate.